right, I'd next like to welcome to the stage Erin and Drew Gaugler. They grew up on a farm and ranch in southwest North Dakota. Both continued their education, Drew in mechanical engineering, Erin in range science, and eventually made their way, as a choice, back to the farm on a full-time basis. Together they manage a cow, calf, and sheep operation along with cropland, hayland, CRP, and today they're here to talk about long-term investments they're making in their fields to reduce erosion, increase water infiltration and retention, and increase habitat for our wildlife friends and invertebrates. So please help me welcome Erin and Drew to the stage.
Good morning, and it's good to be here. I want to thank the organizers and the attendees for being here today. You ready?
All right, so just to give you a little bit of background about where we're from, as she said, we're located in southwest, We're located in southwest, how do I make the laser work? Okay. All right, so as I was saying, we're located in southwest North Dakota, Grant County, near the South Dakota border. Just for some context, depending on where you're from, our average annual precip is about 14 inches. I always say that that's an average, and in our location, we always plan and manage to be in a drought. Some years we can anticipate quite a bit of moisture, and other years it's very limited, but more often than not, we are in a fairly dry region. As far as winter moisture is concerned, it's pretty variable. Last year we had about 100 inches of snow, and this year we've had a few. So every year keeps us on our toes.
Well, we've got a lot of slides to get through today, so we probably should get right into it. This is where my great-grandfather came. He was too young to homestead. He bought this place in 1923. He rented it for a few years before then, and then straight into the Dust Bowl days. So 1957, this land east of the place, you can see lines around fields. Those are blow sand ridges and scars of the practices that were being done. It's not to any of the homestead people's faults. There was the technology that they had, the economic restraints that they had, and then a lot of the homestead requirements were to farm half of the land, whether it was suitable to be farmed or not. This area here, this white, that's clay pans that have that have emerged after the soil had blown away from farming practices. And we're going to go forward into 1995. The government encouraged strip farming, and you can see these white areas. Those are hilltops where the soil is all blown away. This here has gone back into native pasture. As you can see, all the clay pans are still there. They have not healed in that amount of time. 2004, over here, you see all those darker lines. That's washing. All the soil coming out of the hills and washing down through and eventually leaving the property. We still got clay pans everywhere. 2010, the landowner required the renter to plant alfalfa quit strip farming, and it helped. Again, still clay pans. This is a big clay pan area here. And up in here, this is a mix of clay pan and white alkali that's emerging. So in 2017 is the first year that I had management of this. This is, well, 2016 actually, but if you see all these little green dots and white dots, that's some composting going on. That is residue from our bale grazing operations. You can see these white lines. I'm actually broke down here. I'm trenching a water line. Same thing here, installing water tanks to move, be able to have rotational grazing and bale graze better on those fields.
So this is another location on our operation. This is just all to kind of provide you with a background and some examples of some of the resource concerns that we started facing and we're trying to address. And so this particular location, in 1995, there was some strip farming occurring. Similar to the image Drew was showing you, you can see some blown out hilltops starting to show up. Moving on into 2004, more of those hilltops are being eroded away. There's also some concentration of erosion in the valleys, but it was at this time that our folks planted this piece of ground to a perennial. And the perennial was established across most of the field, but on the hilltops, there was really no growth or extension of those plant species. So moving on into 2006, a couple years after that perennial was planted and quote unquote established, but not productive, you can see that we went in and we were basically hunting and pecking and scraping together some hay in those lower, more productive areas. You can also see that it wasn't worth our time and we got out of there pretty quickly. So now moving into 2010, this was a fairly wet year and we started thinking about those hilltops and the challenges with the plant production, and we decided to start hauling manure because what else better could we do with our time? And that one particular hilltop is where we hauled load after load from our headquarters, which round trip is probably about a 10-mile trip. And you can see that there was a response, but was it worth our effort and our time and the cost of doing that? So we started thinking about that over the following winter.
So in these pictures, it's just an illustration of, this is a fence line along a field. There is not much soil left here. This fence has been raised time after time. Some places where you go, they tell you to go to your fence line to see what your topsoil was when it was original. I don't really believe that because a lot of this soil landed right there. When you go out here, it's lower, but this is pretty common. Just soil in the air, blowing away. Cattle trailing, saline seeps coming up out of the ground.
Have a couple of videos here just kind of showing what is common when the wind blows.
That dirt cloud could be seen for about 30 miles.
Second video, this is actually along Highway 49 in North Dakota, and it is traditionally a road ditch that we make hay in, but not that time, not that year.
So here is, in the first slides, I was showing you my yard. This is coming from the neighbors, the runoff. Big rain event, a lot of dirt in the soil or in the water, and that would rush right through the property. Here's some of the land today where I've got check dams, but you still have to deal with large runoff events.
So as the soil has blown and we've lost a lot of that topsoil, what we are left with in a lot of our locations is exposed clay pans, which is going to limit our forage production and our overall utilization of those acres. You can see, especially I guess in pictures 2 and 3, the transition in soil types occurs pretty quickly throughout the fields as well. So I guess when we discussed how we wanted to approach some of the practices that we've been implementing to address all of these different resource concerns, we kind of went back through a chronological approach in terms of some of the things that our grandpa implemented and then what our folks have carried on, and how we have continued to change and address what we do to manage these resource concerns. And so when our grandpa was involved with the operation, he initially began planting trees. He was involved with the soil conservation districts and participated in a lot of programs with them. And at the time, those plantings were pretty popular for field and windbreak protection, especially around the farmstead. And this is the farmstead. It's changed quite a bit, but some of these plantings were initially put in by Grandpa. And then our folks continued that, but they also added in protection for livestock, and we're also really interested in creating more habitat for the wildlife that we had around the place. Drew and I have continued those efforts and actually gone back to some of what Grandpa initially did, which was putting in plantings along the field boundaries. The idea being to catch a lot of the snow, take advantage of some of those leaves that would end up on the soil surface and try and put that down into contact with the ground more. Basically for us, the more that we can capture that moisture, slow it down, and keep it on our landscape, the better. And so trees have always been a common part of our practice. And over the years from when Grandpa started planting to where we are at now, we have, I guess we've increased from about 7 miles of trees to about 17 miles.
So another practice that we employ is a lot of rotational grazing. There's all kinds of materials and methods that you can use. Permanent, temporary, it really doesn't matter what's available in your area. Here you can see some well pipe used for fences. Here's some composite fences that was involved in a prairie fire that didn't work very well, but what would? And it's really to provide rest and rotation. It's a management tool. You can hit some areas pretty hard repeatedly to control invasive species. The trampling puts puts the plants in contact with the soil to feed the microbiome. We want to reduce trailing and improve our water quality. Here, it's kind of hard to see, but we've got pastures and fences and everything split every which way, and it just keeps continuing. Lots of fences to manage, lots of water. We went from 22 pastures when my parents came back in the early 80s. Now we think we're up to 75 permanent pastures, 43 miles of barbed wire, and 23 miles of permanent electric fence.
We also continue to employ tillage and no tillage practices. Sometimes the tillage practices people might give us a hard time about, but there have been instances on certain fields where the tillage has been needed to smooth that field base and give us a chance to employ no-till and ensure that that system can stay in a longer term no-till management, especially if we are looking to hay those fields, because you spend a lot of time several times over that field, and it begins to wear and tear on your body if there were any dead furrows or things like that. We also have employed some subsoiling practices, which we will talk about a little bit more in detail later, but the subsoiling concept is basically putting a slit in the ground, opening it up, allowing for some aeration to occur, water infiltration, and depositing some organic matter into those slits.
Then we go into water development. Pipelines, dams, dugouts, they all contribute to our rotational grazing opportunities. We have put water on our hay fields and cropland to give us a little insurance policy in case something fails. You can graze that residue. Some areas, like over here, this was actually my great-grandfather's corrals and where he stored his winter hay. And sometime in the 80s, the water table rose and it became a stagnant place, and all the manure concentration from all of his years, it kind of became a problem area. So we did do some drain tiling there and move the water to a drier area that could benefit from this excess water. It's a management tool. To date, with our water lines, we're up to 7.5 miles of water lines across the property.
Which the water lines and the development there is, I guess that's the critical part of being able to utilize the livestock pretty much on any parcel of the ground. So the livestock are really a key component for us.
Here I am drilling a well, some winter tire tanks, and we employ a lot of solar water units. The windmills just don't hold up with our wind. We're up to 22 wells on the property, 39 watering facilities that are permanent, and 12 solar pumping units. It's changing quite a bit. Here's a picture of dam building. It's my father. We used to employ dams, dugouts for cattle water. Cattle would spend too much time in it. It would become a water quality issue for the cattle, for the property. Now I build leaky dams. They fill up with runoff water, they recharge the groundwater, and what doesn't go directly down into the ground, it sub-irrigates the property down below it. It catches erosion. It just has completely changed our operation, and we're up to 43 of those now.
Another shift that we made, well, actually, I guess, kind of went through a couple different transitions. My grandpa, when he was initially involved, he calved with nature around April and May, and then when our folks came back, they pushed calving earlier and earlier with the idea that they could potentially have bigger calves. And there was different challenges by calving earlier. We fought the weather a lot more, dealt with animals being a little in the concentrated pens. the muck of the corral wasn't always great for those animals. And with our weather, those calves, they spent a lot of energy just trying to survive and didn't put it into growing. And so we have transitioned back into calving later in the spring. Most of our calving occurs late April, early May. And we continually we've continued to move out where we calve. We prefer to calve on pastures with those early cool season invasives to try and utilize those plant species when they have decent nutritional quality. We have also done some calving while we were bale grazing, and that has worked well. We always are rotating where our calving pastures occur, the idea being that we can spread out where that nutrient concentration is occurring and can continue to manage some of those early cool season grasses. We also have been involved with planting cover crops. Cover crops, they have been a fairly popular practice, and they can look like a lot of different things depending on where you're at and how it can work in your system. For us in our moisture regime, if we're going to plant a cover crop, that is the cover crop, or that is the crop that is grown that year. There's not really an opportunity to do double cropping, and so that is meant to provide a forage base for our livestock, and usually that would be late fall, early winter grazing. I guess the biggest component for us is to think about what our goal is when we're planting those cover crops. It seems like it's really easy to approach cover crops thinking that they are going to be a cure-all or a fix-all. And for us, it's been important to really have a particular goal in mind. The other incentive with planting cover crops, of course, is to provide more carbon to the soil and to promote that biological activity. We do have some examples of failures with the cover crops, and we found that in our salt-affected areas, when we planted cover crops, those often got larger and larger. And so just learning to work with our resources and changing our practices was important. Another practice that we employ is bale grazing. And for us, this is a winter feeding strategy. And it was designed primarily to address soil health and as a way to renovate some older hay fields. What that has looked like for us changes every single year. This picture on the left is the very first year that my folks employed bale grazing, and we're very apprehensive about it working. And the next picture up on the top right is a couple years ago, and then the bottom right is this last winter. And so you can see that there has been a change in overall density and distribution of those bales. And the intent for us is to basically make our winter feeding easier. We want the cattle to work more for us. We don't want to be tied into working our butts off for them, especially in the winter. We also want them to be out there on the landscape distributing the manure. We don't want to spend all of our time like we did back in 2004, hauling out load after load after load from the corrals out to that field. We want to limit our tractor use. So now we start the tractor in the fall to distribute those bales, and there's times when we maybe burn a half a tank of diesel fuel in the winter. That is sometimes weather dependent, and it also may depend on how we set up that particular bale grazing system. The important part of this whole bale grazing concept is that it, aside from the manure, it's also taking advantage of the carbon that's out there, putting it into contact with the soil, providing an opportunity for that water to be held in that carbon, and also to introduce some other plant species into those hayfields as well. It has It has allowed us to renovate hay fields. For example, we have several fields that have been in continuous production for 20 years, not having to break them up, reseed them, etc. So just some examples of different weather conditions that we've done it in and what it has looked like. You can do it in years where there's very little snow, like this year, but we found that it actually works best when there is some snow on the ground, as those animals are incentivized to utilize that feed source and clean up on it. We also have incorporated sheep as of a few years ago. The idea was that we thought that they would utilize that resource differently and that they would change the manure distribution as well.
One important part about the manure in bale grazing is the fact that in nature, decomposition of manure is usually aerobic, not anaerobic. So it produces very little, if nothing, for methane. It does produce a little bit of CO2, but very, very minimal. So here's calves laying on the hay. That's after the cows had eaten. The calves found their way back to the previous section of bales. We found that the calves like to do that, spread out. It's better for their health. The next picture over is what's left. There were bales there. And then we don't remove the net wrap. We let the cows move the net wrap. And then we just come along behind and pick it up later. It's pretty easy. It's a lot easier than crawling in and out of a tractor 10 times. So here is forage response. So again, this is 2004 and the washing and clay pans and blown out hills. And then here is the response. Over here you can see these lines of green dots. Every bale you can count that I fed. Up here we did a bale grazing with sheep where we went across 5 sections 3 times each in the winter. And then again to the east you can see all the bale grazing circles and residue. You can also see building a dam and other things on the property, but the forage response is pretty huge. Again, this is that property that Erin spoke about, and this is pretty well covered. The longer you bale graze, the more it fills in. It's healing. Here are some zoomed in pictures. Up here you can see where there were bales, and then this is where I'd like more bales. Same thing here. This is all after I grazed this field instead of haying it, so this would essentially be the second cutting. And it's pretty evident.
So there's several numbers, but I'll try and guide you through them. Just for background, on this particular sample location in 2016 through 2018, cover crops were planted prior to this sample location going into a bale grazing system, and then in 2019 it was planted to a perennial. So we had a few years of cover cropping, a winter of bale grazing, and then it was planted to a perennial. As far as the sample locations go, I have a historic sample site in 2016, so that was taken before any of these management practices were implemented. There's the direct impact column, and that was samples that were taken directly under a hay bale that had been grazed, and then indirect is in the same location but not directly under a grazed hay bale. And the important part too is that fall of 2019 was right after we bale grazed the first year, and there was no other bale grazing practices happening. And so the fall of 2023, we pulled more samples again, but no other bale grazing had happened except for the winter of of 2018. And in regards to, well, pH is pretty variable, as you can see. A lot of that is moisture dependent, depending on what's going on in the year. With nitrogen, you can see that there was a response to bale grazing, fall of 2019. Again, no other bale grazing has occurred, but we're still seeing a response several years later. And phosphorus had similar trends as nitrogen, but it is more influenced by rainfall due to its solubility. Organic matter, looking at those numbers. So in 2019, we do see a dip in response, and we think that that was occurring because the cover crops were using some of the existing organic matter, and that there was potentially a lag in the breakdown of added residue from the bale grazing practice. But we are now in 2023 starting to see a response. So thank you. Okay, so now when we were taking all of these measurements, we started getting more interested in some of the biological activity, and we started adding other protocols, things that we probably should have been doing all along to understand the system from the beginning. But on this slide, we are looking at the fall of 2020 and 2021, and then we also took measurements in the spring of 2022. This particular location, we bale grazed in the winter of 2020 and 2021. The summer of 21 was very dry, but in the late fall, we had about 10 inches of rain. So when we look at nitrogen, during the summer of 21, because of all of that extra rainfall, we suspect that there was some leaching that occurred, but we do see a boost that showed up in the spring of 2022. In terms of the available nutrients, that's anticipating what would be available to the next crop. And then I guess the thing to point out with phosphorus too is that we suspect that there was some leaching going on because of all that extra moisture. The CO2C, that's a measure of biological activity. We did see a response from the fall of 2020 to 2021, but those numbers were lower in the spring of 22. And we're thinking that because we took those samples early in the spring, that soil was still cold and those organisms were still waking up. I guess the important part to think about with this is that because this was in a perennial system, we're not as concerned about the numbers that indicate that there might be some leaching, because with those deeper tap roots of the perennials, we still can gain access to them and bring them back up to the surface. We have also implemented grazing of our hayfields more and more, especially as we've added those water developments. We have also shifted from the summer after bale grazing. We now graze those hayfields as opposed to going into those with equipment and putting that up for hay. For us, it's a way of managing any existing residue in response to bale grazing. There's some rotations where the cattle don't clean up quite as well. There's sometimes we have to move them earlier because of an anticipated snowstorm. And so rather than running our equipment through any of that residue, we just will graze the animals through it. We also do have some challenges with alfalfa weevils, and having the animals out there disturbing some of those pest cycles has been really beneficial. And we do this by using temporary fence, which allows us to do a lot more strip grazing so we can intensively graze those areas. As we said, we also added sheep, and sheep for us were not only a added revenue stream, but they have proven really beneficial in some of the areas that we consider fragile. So over here is a wetland kind of highlighted in green. In the past, cattle have had access to those wetlands. They have traditionally not used them, and due to the fragile nature of those wetlands, you know, if the cattle would have been using them, it would have been potentially problematic. And so we have now fenced off those areas with a kind of a boundary fence, and we continue to use temporary fence materials to strip graze along. The hooves of the sheep aren't quite as destructive as the hooves of the cattle. They're pretty nimble in those areas, and the intensive grazing allows us to begin to shift some of the plant communities back into more native plant populations.
Here's another practice. What do you do with all those rocks that are in your fields? Planting or putting in check dams, it's kind of changed for us. And again, what do you do with all the net wrap from your winter feeding? Some people pile it up and burn it. And, well, is that good for the environment? I don't really think so, but what do you do with it? Take it to the landfill? Well, I've started putting it in the check dams where you do a layer of rocks, layer of net wrap. It becomes a sediment catch. It controls erosion. Ideally, it would be nice not to have plastic, but it's an evil that we have. And in that last picture, you could still see over here, this check dam has caught water. There's new soil that is filled in here. Those ditches and old scars are filling in. Enhances water infiltration too. Here's a large check dam, and when you see this, you'd realize you need more, because what do you do? Again, it cleans the water. I've got a lot of these going through my property, and I like to go out during big rainfall events or the spring melt, and then progressively as you go further down your property, the water gets cleaner and cleaner until it's no sediment at all in it. Here, we have started using keyline cultivation. It's basically using a subsoiler in a pattern that redirects your runoff water out of the valleys. So with this contour map, your water would run right down the valley, and I want it to run out onto your ridges where your soil is thin, where it's more porous and the water can go in the ground and do something for you. We've employed this also in some bale grazing areas. We're using the runoff water to move the manure and the hay residue into these slits in the ground that you can see. It puts the manure, the hay residue into a cool, moist environment, helps with the decomposition and retention of nutrients. The biological activity of the soil, it needs food, oxygen, and water. And when we're in a 14-inch rainfall area, some years it's 6 inches of rain, some years it's 30. Water control is pretty necessary, and that's just kind of the whole concept of the keyline. And again, I mean, you can fill up all these slits of water, then you have a column 18 inches deep of water. It's going to go down more than it's going to go across your surface and down to a creek and leave your property.
So I guess the important part of this slide is thinking about those slits that we're putting in the ground. And over on the far right, you can see some measurements for 0 to 6 and 6 to 24 inches. And there's differences occurring. And our hope is that by putting that manure, that oxygen and the water lower into the profile, we have an opportunity to increase, to improve the soil health deeper into the soil profile.
Some research has shown that biological life is greatly reduced or it's not at all in hardpan areas that are above 300 psi. And here you can see our readings of a certain site with a penetrometer. So 300 psi and above is not good for your biological life. So we did a above reading, so that isn't affected by the keyline rip, which means there was no place for biological life. And this is the depth. But in between the rips, it started off with being compact. Probably a cow stood on it, so it's a little, but you can see a trend line where it is slightly less. And then in the rip area, you've got room for more depth of soil to have biological life in it.
So we're doing a lot of things to try and address all of these resource concerns. And you've heard a couple of speakers this morning talk about the value of the relationships that they have with people. And for us, having the opportunity to speak and share with you is more about the opportunity to learn from the people here as well. And so we've employed lots of outreach efforts, but all of those opportunities are opportunities for us to learn from others as well. And I think that is being highlighted here at the conference today by all the other speakers, is that the value of our relationships, the value of the soil, and how interconnected we all are is really, really important.
I also want to point out that we are quite busy, so if anybody wants to help plant trees or fence or do anything that they want to learn about, please, we need everything. Here's some resources that we look towards. South Dakota Grazing Lands Coalition has been a good group to work with. North Dakota also. North Dakota Water Commission has a lot of maps for looking at your land throughout the years. I don't know if Colorado has an opportunity for that.
And then we work with a number of different groups to, get ideas, employ some of these practices. I guess the host mentioned last night that the producers may or may not be as familiar with SARE. They're a group that we've worked with more recently, and they give us an opportunity to do on-farm research, implement the practices, and have been a really, flexible organization to work with. They understand the nature of working with farmers and ranchers and how things change. But as you can see, there's a number of different groups that we work with. Fish and Wildlife has also been a great resource. They also bring in funding from a lot of different organizations that aren't specifically highlighted here today. But we've just found that, going back to the people, as you work with different folks, you develop some really great working relationships, and it can be amazing what you do when you put your minds together. So we just wanted to take the time to acknowledge them, to acknowledge the folks that organize this event, and thank them for the opportunity to share about some of what we do as well. And I think we're ready for questions.
Oh, great. Never mind. You guys can read. Thank you. Also, did you know Erin just finished her PhD? Woo!
The question is, did you have resistance from your grandparents, parents, or neighbors when it came to some of the changes you began implementing? Did or have any neighbors adopted practices?
Our grandpa was not involved in the operation at the point that we became involved. He was involved when my parents came back in the early 80s, and he did not necessarily like to see some of the changes. He knew changes needed to be made. So he moved off the farm to manage that for himself. With our parents, they're a lot more open-minded than some family is. And neighbors, we do continue to see neighbors changing. They don't necessarily do it close to the road where anybody else sees it, but
What financial improvements have you experienced by implementing these changes?
increased productivity. Our production off our hay fields has doubled, tripled.
Also, incorporating sheep was a benefit because there was a lot of places that we just weren't using. And to make infrastructure changes to be able to incorporate sheep, there was some upfront cost, but we tried to minimize that as much as possible by, implementing a fall lambing herd or fall lambing flock, just adapting our existing fences by adding one hot wire, et cetera. So
Some of the changes take years and years to see the financial turn. Some of those pastures will change within 1 or 2 years, and some of them will take a long time.
what equipment do you swear by? Oh, swear by or at? Subsoiler.
Whatever's affordable that you can find. We aren't particular to red or green or orange, or it's affordable, and don't be afraid to work on it.
And implementing it in ways that maybe aren't traditional, like our subsoiler is, used for the concept of those key line plows, but if we can flip up a couple of those furrow lines, maybe we can use that to lay weed barrier for our trees, things like that.
We've used no-till drills where we just go to a convention and steal all the magnets, and then you block off every couple holes in your no-till drill.
And you have a corn planter.
Yep. Whatever you can do to get by. And
I would add too, one piece of equipment that really helped us with changing where we calve was buying a couple maternity pens and some portable panels. So that way we weren't having, we have some barns and stuff that were for the livestock, but we really aren't using those much at all anymore. The next question is, have you tried putting in plants in your leaky dams, maybe to filter and hold water?
Garrison creeping foxtail we use a lot because it can be underwater for 6 weeks, and by the time those dams leak away, then it's growing nicely. The birds, the dust, the wind, everything, it'll bring seeds and plants in there for you too. But
do the hay bales you are using for bale grazing have mature seed heads? Is it reseeding the fields?
sometimes.
Yes. Yes and no.
Sometimes we make CRP hay or hay from different areas and haul that in.
We try to, just to feed the number of livestock that we have and to limit the amount of fuel being employed to carry out bale grazing, we do try to feed the hay that's produced on that field. So it's not, those nutrients aren't being exported. And that might require 2, maybe into the 3rd year of stockpiling those bales and then bale grazing. So we rotate where we're bale grazing from 1 year to the next.
And we have fed cover crop bale grazing on pasture and had turnips and introduced red clover and all sorts of things out into the pasture too.
So when you bale the hay, do you gather the bales and redistribute them at feeding, or just leave them where they are baled and move the cattle to them?
Yes.
So yeah, like I said, we stockpile for a couple years. The year that we know we're going to bale graze, those bales are just kicked out. And then in the late fall, we'll go out with a tractor and spend a couple days distributing those bales. Initially, we would concentrate on the areas where we had those resource concerns, the blown out hilltops, et cetera. And now we pretty much just do it across the whole landscape.
We've found that every acre, every place could benefit from it. Your productive bottoms, they respond just as much or more as your blown out hilltops and alkali areas. We just want more cows and more residue and more.
All right, thank you.
Please help me thank
Thank
the
you.
Gauglers.